doors had never opened. There was no way she could have left.
Welcome to the Dark List. The stories from the other side of the razor.
By the time they saw the wave, it was already far too late. A wall of water more than 40 meters high crashed into the Tohoku region of Japan that day, killing thousands. The most powerful earthquake in Japan's history had unleashed a tsunami that tore 10 kilometers inland, destroying everything in its path. Months later, survivors began rebuilding both their city and their lives, slowly coming to terms with the loss. As one taxi pulled up to an address, the driver felt a quiet pride at the progress being made since that terrible March afternoon. It was a testament, he thought, to the spirit of the Japanese people. But when he turned to the young woman he had picked up earlier, pride was replaced by confusion, and then by unease. The passenger seat was empty. The doors had never opened. The taxi had been moving the entire journey. There was no way she could have left. The driver suddenly recalled a story that he had recently heard from one of the other drivers. A tale everyone had laughed off. But now, panic began to rise. Tonight, the Dark List presents The Ghosts of the Tsunami. In the months after the disaster, Ishinomaki was a city in ruins. Entire districts had been flattened, streets swept bare, and families torn apart in seconds. Amid the wreckage, survivors began whispering about something stranger than the disaster itself. Taxi drivers who had picked up passengers that were no longer alive. One driver described stopping for a young man standing at the side of the road, drenched and silent. The passenger gave him an address in one of the coastal neighborhoods, so the driver turned on the meter and drove. But when he arrived, the area was nothing but empty foundations and debris. He turned to the back seat to ask again, and found it empty. Another driver remembered a young woman who asked to be taken to Minamihama, one of the districts most completely erased by the tsunami. He explained that there was nothing left there. She only repeated the request. He began to feel a chill down his spine, but he drove anyway. At the edge of the wasteland, he looked back, and the seat was vacant. In total, at least 7 different taxi drivers in Ishinomaki told nearly identical stories. These weren't barroom ghost tales whispered years later. They were documented by a student from Tohoku Gakuin University who interviewed drivers directly as part of his research. Many of the drivers even recorded the journeys in their logbooks, complete with times, locations, and in some cases, fares that had run up on the meter before they noticed they were driving alone. For the drivers, the experiences were not entertainment. They were unsettling, sometimes terrifying, but above all, they felt real. In Japan, it is said that spirits who die suddenly, violently, or without proper rituals can wander in confusion, unaware of their own deaths. The tsunami had left thousands without funerals or graves. Whole families were swept away in an instant, with no chance to say goodbye. In this light, the stories of passengers trying to return home seemed less like fantasy and more like the natural consequence of spirits still searching for peace. The ghosts of Ishinomaki were not limited to taxis. Survivors spoke of hearing children's voices echoing in the yards of schools that had been reduced to rubble. Families saw shadows of loved ones lingering in doorways where no doors remained. Priests were called upon to perform rites of cleansing and exorcism for people who believed they had been possessed by the restless dead. But it was the taxi drivers' accounts that stood out because they were so concrete. A passenger enters. The car moves. And then, nothing. Even now, more than a decade later, the story of the taxi ghosts remains one of the most striking legacies of the tsunami. They are not easily brushed aside as rumor or hysteria. They were repeated, consistent, and logged by working men who had no reason to fabricate them. Perhaps these drivers became unwitting ferrymen for the dead, carrying souls on the last journey back to neighborhoods that no longer existed. Perhaps the passengers vanished not because they were never there, but because they had finally arrived where they were meant to be. And in Ishinomaki, when the night grows quiet and the streets fall empty, there are still drivers who glance into the rearview mirror and wonder who might be riding with them. The taxi passengers who provide directions only to vanish. Disembodied voices of children echoing in abandoned playgrounds. Priests were called to perform rituals for survivors who claimed they had been possessed by the restless dead. There were people who woke in the night speaking in voices that weren't their own, and these were far from isolated accounts. They spread from district to district, told by survivors with no reason to invent them. Recorded by respected and established universities, tales of drivers who have logged fares for passengers only for them to disappear. Families swore to the voices of children they could not see. Whole communities turned to religion, convinced the spirits of the drowned were walking among them. Individually, each story might be dismissed, but taken together they paint a picture that defies easy explanation. A city overwhelmed not just by water, but by ghosts. So there we have it. Another story from the other side of the razor. A story that refuses to sit neatly in its box. A story that pushes at the edges of what we call explanation. Because the official line, the safe line, is that grief can play tricks. That sorrow can bend the mind until it gives us phantoms to cling to. But if that were all, then how do we account for the precision, the repetition? The evidence of journeys requested, recorded but never completed. Coincidence, mass delusion, or something darker, lingering, restless. Shadows still wandering, still searching for a way home. This has been the Dark List and the ghosts of the tsunami. And remember, sleeping with the lights on won't save you.